So he was writing this book in a world in which, financial services were tightly regulated, surface transportation, air transportation, fixed exchange rates, and on and on. So he talks about privatization of Social Security, a whole lot of ideas that were just really seen as very far out at the time. And it's surprising how much what he argues in here, which was seen as so extreme at the time, has become much more accepted, much more commonplace. And it shows the power of ideas. It didn't happen overnight, but gradually people began to appreciate the market kind of arguments he made. So it's a great book to read, and I'd really encourage you to do it if you haven't. Okay, so I was asked to talk about education, and one of the things that one of the chapters in Capitalism and Freedom, and one thing that Friedman wrote about quite a bit and talked about was the role of government in education. And Friedman argues, and I'm going to focus in this discussion in the book, he talked about both higher ed and K-12. I'm going to focus on K-12 in my remarks. Friedman lays out, he always starts from first principles, and he said, why do we subsidize K-12 education? And he lays out kind of the traditional arguments. And he talks about neighborhood effects. He gives a variety of reasons, but one of the most important comes down on his neighborhood effects, which is what we'd call externalities. I'm better off if you are well educated in a democratic society. We need an educated public. But what he points out is he said, look, just because there's a strong argument for subsidizing K-12 education, there's not a strong argument for the government producing most of it. And the fact is, right now, the government produces 90% of K-12 education. About 90% of kids are in traditional public schools. So he talks about the nationalized schooling sector. And if you think about other sectors like housing, food, medicine, we have subsidies there, right? We have housing vouchers. We have all kinds of increasing government intervention in medicine, but still most of it is still produced by private firms, either for-profit or not-for-profit. But in education, the government has a much larger role. And so he kind of takes on the argument is why do we do this? And he concludes that there isn't a good case, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But he laid out what at the time seemed like a really far out idea, which was vouchers for K-12 education. Say, look, there's a good case for subsidy, but we should voucherize this and let individuals make their own choices. And these vouchers could vary with income. Lower income folks could get higher vouchers. They could vary with need. Special needs kids could get higher vouchers. And he also felt in here and elsewhere that you would want individuals to be able to add some of their own money, because if they have skin in the game, they'll be better consumers. They'll pay attention to what they're buying and insist on quality. Now, why does this? So what do we get out of choice in terms of K-12? Well, I'd argue, and Friedman argues, that this is, if you think about this sector, this is one sector where it's pretty clear that one size doesn't fit all. And clear illustration of that is the private school sector. So we've had private schools that long predate public schools. And if you look at that sector, it's all over the place. The kids learn how to read, and they learn math, and they learn civics, but they do it in very different ways. I mean, you got Montessori schools, and Waldorf schools, and Lutheran schools, and Catholic schools, and military academies, and a whole independent sector. So why is this a positive thing? Well, basically, you've got a market here where on the demand side, parents and children have different preferences and needs. you know, parents, and you have very well, on the whole, very well-informed consumers who know what they want. And then on the other side, it allows you schools to specialize. These private schools have a mission. They say, look, if it's a Montessori school, this is what we do. Here's the Montessori approach. Here's our philosophy. Here's how we do it. If you want to teach in this school, you know, if you're a teacher and you want to do Montessori, you go to a Montessori school and teach. So it works on the labor market side too. And so it allows this kind of sorting, you know, in this kind of a market with these sort of very idiosyncratic kind of consumer preferences and then idiosyncratic kind of producers. And of course, higher ed's very similar to this sort of another example of this. You can have big universities and small universities and so on. So there's a lot of reasons why, especially in a market like this, that you would expect choice to work, and there's a good case for choice. So I want to keep my remarks short here, but let me just say a word on research. In the time since Friedman wrote Capitalism and Freedom, we've had a lot of experiments in choice. We've actually have voucher programs and given students vouchers and given them some opportunities to attend private schools and Catholic schools. What do we know from this research? Well, in my own reading, and we can talk about this in question and answer, the research on private schools, which is primarily on Catholic schools, is almost uniformly positive, particularly for urban students and particularly for poor kids, minority kids. That there's a large body of research that tracks kids forward, and when kids get the opportunity to attend primarily Catholic schools, you found positive effects. There's been a few studies of vouchers, direct studies of vouchers, and these actually were randomized studies. That is, these are situations where there was an excess demand for the vouchers, and kids were randomly accepted into the program. So you've got something that actually is a randomized study. So you track the kids that didn't get in, you track the kids that did. And most of these studies have been quite positive, particularly on high-stakes outcomes like graduation. So we can talk about that. So this idea, my reading of the evidence, and I don't think this is controversial, on vouchers and Catholic schools and the private school sector is pretty positive, that it has worked where it's been implemented. Now the other strand, the whole school choice thing kind of went off in another direction with charter schools. Because of much objection, and it didn't have to do with economics, but sort of Blaine Amendment arguments, separation of church and state. Vouchers were seen as unconstitutional, or at least not acceptable. And so you got some of these public school choice experiments where the evidence is a little more mixed. We have a lot of charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City. There's some newer studies that are looking at charter schools that have waiting lists. The charter schools have to let kids in a random way when you have a waiting list. And in those kind of studies, you generally tend to find positive effects, and sometimes very large positive effects. But as a whole, it's a little bit more mixed, and Show Me has a nice survey of the research in this area. But if you think about it, it's kind of an odd way we introduce choice, and it's really not surprising because most of these charter schools are new, they're startups, and so what we did with this charter school experiment is we excluded the seasoned players from the market, the Catholic schools, the Lutheran schools that have been around for a century. And we got a bunch of new startups, some of which are been very successful, like KIPP schools and so on. Others have had a mixed record. So at any rate, the bottom line is, and we can talk about the choice experience, is ideas do matter. Friedman began talking about this 40 years ago. Choice, I think now, in terms of K-12, is pretty well accepted. You know, I think most everyone agrees, even sort of bipartisan, that parents should have choice about the schools they attend. There's disagreement about whether Catholic schools should be in that choice set. But, you know, these ideas about free markets have really made a lot of advancement in this area in ed policy, and I'll leave it at that, a lot of it came from Friedman and his students. Well, the best is, the gold standard in these studies is when you have random assignment to a treatment and control group. And you're getting a number of studies, including a big one that was just supported by the U.S. Department of Education of the DC voucher program, which Congress recently eliminated, which found generally positive effects. So the research has become more and more sophisticated, and we're getting more and more studies that have this randomized design where, you know, you're randomly assigned to a treatment or control group. Treatment meaning you get vouchered in, or a control, you don't. No, that's a very good point, and that was on my yellow sheet. I just ran out of time. In all of these cases, yeah, it's short. I mean, I actually wrote down a couple numbers here. You know, even if you end up with no difference in student achievement, for example, St. Louis Public Schools is spending almost $16,000 a student in current costs, whereas the charter schools here are spending a lot less than that. Confluence Academy, at most recent numbers, 08, $9,000 a student. Lift for Life, about $9,900. So, you know, in these voucher cases, the vouchers are always much less than what the public schools are spending. So, yeah, that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Just a personal aside, Mike was chairman of the economics department at MU when I was hired at MU in 2000. And as a faculty member, you learned that when you were making an argument trying to convince Mike that you needed more money or more resources, one of the things you always tried to was to keep things off of his yellow pad. He can remember those, but the rest wasn't so good. Thank you, Mike, for your insights. Let's move on. Professor Susan Feigenbaum is now going to share her insights on Professor Friedman's work.
Okay. Before I begin, I want to thank the Show Me Institute for inviting me today to share some comments with you. I happen to be somebody who believes very strongly in recognizing and remembering those intellectual giants upon whose shoulders we stand, both out of respect for them and secondly from a more narrow efficiency viewpoint in the sense of why reinvent the wheel when it's been invented so well in the first place? I had the pleasure of interacting with Professor Friedman in the late 80s, early 90s, as we debated and disagreed on solutions to the healthcare crisis. I happen to be somebody who, beyond Wisconsin, has been brought up in the libertarian tradition of Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, and our views somewhat differed from Professor Friedman's, who believed that by getting rid of the tax deductibility of health insurance, you would solve the healthcare crisis. We disagreed with that from a moral hazard standpoint, and I'm happy to speak about that more later. But I have always, as Mike said, had a tremendous respect for Professor Friedman. Perhaps it's because he was just another short Jewish economist like myself. But Professor Friedman influenced my thinking in a very important way that I'd like to talk about, and as Mike did, I brought Capitalism and Freedom today, and hope I can share a few of his words with you, and that is in the area of discrimination. Some of you recall Milton Friedman's own personal history. He came into academics at a time when Jews and other minorities were not particularly welcomed in an overwhelming number in many East Coast, many Ivy League institutions. And Friedman migrated eventually with people like Aaron Director to the University of Chicago. And one of the things that we've certainly seen from the University of Chicago over the last decades is that it became the single greatest source of Nobel laureates in economics.